Alright, so there's a lot to get into today, so I'm going to get right at it. First things first, as far as these testing protocols and that sort of stuff, I'm pretty uniform across the board with how I apply these testing protocols and that sort of thing to the individual handguns that are being brought up for testing. And generally speaking, once I get to the end point of all this, I more or less just say, hey, it's reliable, or hey, it's not. That said, once you have heard the testing protocol for this whole thing, if you would like to actually see that being executed, that's pretty simple for me to accomplish, because all that means is I have to bring a camera out one extra time or one or two extra times to more or less show our process. But if you've heard the testing protocol and you're like, yeah, it's pretty standard for a lot of modern auto-loading handguns, I don't really need the details or the B-roll accompanying that, we're good. I understand that too. So let me know what you think about it at the end as far as the testing goes. And now let's get into our actual standards. So, the following is a 6,000 round service life test, which actually does include a little bit of reliability testing, and there's a permissible stoppage rate, because generally speaking, the vast majority of the ammunition that's going to be used throughout this testing is, as far as proportions are concerned, 115 grain target ammunition, which, when it's compared to 124 grain military ball, as far as optimal function is concerned, 115 grain MagTech is basically trash, because, fun fact, most auto-loading handguns are designed to be run with 124 grain military ball. That's more or less the base standard of stock service or self-defense pistols, right? So unless it has a special purpose as a competition gun or something similar to that, that's usually what it is most likely going to run optimally with. So having a permissible stoppage rate on your target load ammunition at 115, as a for instance, is something that more or less has to be worked in, because there's the quality control stuff that goes with that, as well as the guns themselves not being literally meant to handle this particular load optimally. Throughout the 6,000 round test, the overall permissible stoppage rate is sub 1%. I say sub 1% because at the end of 6,000 rounds, that is just under 60. So 59. This allows me to do two things as far as overall stoppage rate. If I have a heavy bias one way or the other, like if I'm rooting for a particular product, or if I really don't friggin' care about this thing, what it allows me to do is log each individual stoppage that it has and then lean on the numbers. Because realistically speaking, 59 stoppages in 6,000 rounds is essentially nothing. Now, there are a couple of points that are non-permissible in this whole thing. The first one is we run a self-defense load test. Now, you're to find your common use load, and in this particular case, I have a primary and a backup. The primary is Spear Gold Dot 147 grain, which is actually my primary defense load that I generally use. Standard pressures, no plus P stuff, and the reason for that, yeah, I know, there's people that are going to call me a dinosaur in the comments, but it's a consistent loading that performs really well. Flower petal's pretty good, and the difference between its POI and the 115 grains POI is not enormous. There's a little bit of vertical shift usually. At 25, I got about 1.5 inches worth of shift. It's also been around forever, so a modern auto-loading handgun should handle it just fine. But understanding that not all service or self-defense handguns are going to handle every self-defense load equally, I do have a backup, and the backup is actually a little more common as far as overall defense loads that are used, and that's Hornady 124 grain standard pressure as well. Now, if I get to the backup and I run into issues here, now I got real problems, and now I have something to note. However, because you guys have never heard anything about me saying X and Y doesn't work with defense load 1 and 2, is pretty indicative of the fact that most auto-loading handguns are going to handle these grain weights just fine. The other non-permissible thing, and there's a little bit of nuance involved here, but the other non-permissible thing that I have is that in 6,000 rounds, a single malfunction bricks the test. Now, here's what I mean by this. Number one, there's a difference between a stoppage and a malfunction, and I really don't like it when they're used interchangeably. Stoppages are interruption in the natural firing cycle of the handgun, or rifle, or whatever. That is technically the gun going into slide lock. The gun quit cycling and working right? And the fix for that is just reload it, right? No tools required, no nothing. But what are more commonly referred to as stoppages are things like failures to fire, failures to eject, failures to extract, and yeah, eject and extract are two different things, and I'm tired of people using using those interchangeably as well. Point is, all of these are fixable without tools, replacement parts, any of that. Malfunctions are like malnourished people. If you continue to feed them, normally at least, they're going to keep breaking down until the wrong person ends up in the ground. So that's what I mean by this. Something literally breaking, or a bolt eating itself to death, turning into a little blender of metal inside of the action. Or in the case of the aim surplus slide, where its barrel is so soft that it's eating itself to death well inside of 1,000 rounds. I don't permit that sort of thing. However, there is an exception for this sort of deal, and that is things that the factory literally could not detect, and that's tiny little stress fractures. So for instance, if I get an extractor that snaps itself in half, that's kind of hard to detect after the heat treating process, especially if your QC is just a bunch of dudes looking at stuff, right? Being like, yeah, that's right, and then sending it out. Now, yes, I recognize that there are ways to detect this sort of thing, but it's a little more understandable, especially if you're shipping things in mass quantities, to miss something like that. Monday morning, Friday evening, they exist. However, if it's clear that this is part of the factory's process, like PSA putting out AK bolts that are soft, or again, the aim surplus slide with a barrel that's soft, and you're just watching a blender of metal occur, I don't permit that sort of thing. That's something that's not going to be changed basically ever, especially right after a legit malfunction occurs. If you look the thing up and you start seeing other people with similar issues, right? Same thing for the snapped in half extractor as an example as far as that's concerned. You see guys that have those issues, but then that same company is like, all right, first go on our extractors, they suck, here's the new one. That makes more sense. That is what allows me to replace that part and keep going. But if it's obvious that the factory has no intention of correcting this issue, we're done here. And I think that makes sense. Other exceptions and things that I don't do. So for instance, if a pistol is compensated or ported or whatever, and in its initial testing at least, we discovered that it's running into reliability issues. Again, most pistols are not meant to run optimally on 115 grain target. Compensated and ported pistols, way less so. So a lot of times, in order to run reliably with those and still function with defense loads, people have to spring down a little bit in order to get both to reliably function. So in our first few hundred rounds or our first 1,000 rounds or whatever, we start running into reliability problems. Simply changing the spring and then everything works again. I don't count this against that particular configuration because we are running it incorrectly. So that's one thing. So those are my exceptions as far as that's concerned. Now let's talk about stuff that I don't do as far as the overall testing protocol. Today's video is sponsored by the Sonoran Desert Institute. Have you ever thought about making a living in the firearms industry? If you enjoy gun repair, ballistics, learning about firearms, the Sonoran Desert Institute might just be a good fit for you. To find out more about SDI, visit sdi.edu. Use the link in the description down below, or call 480-999-4767 today. And now back to the video. Number one, you are not going to hear me, generally, I'm not going to say never, but you will probably, most likely, not hear me talking about handguns as suppressor hosts. Because here's the thing about suppressor hosts, handguns, and reliability. Those things do not exist in the same sentence favorably. Also, generally speaking, unless there's a friggin' barcode on the back of your neck, walking up into any real situation that isn't a coyote or some nonsense with a suppressor mounted to a handgun is patently ridiculous and pretty dumb to me. I cannot stand handgun suppressors. No handgun that exists is reliable with a suppressor, and people do a whole lot of work to continue to not have a reliable handgun plus suppressor. I don't do these things together. I don't like them together. You're not going to see me testing handgun suppressors because it's a dumb concept. Because look, I recognize that my last name is Bondi, which is the spy plus a Y, but I'm just not that sort of person that just is catching myself screwing a friggin' handgun suppressor onto a handgun, which just magically makes a really, really nice, reliable handgun into an unreliable stapler. I'm not about it. So that's one thing I don't do. Another couple of things that I don't do is like saltwater exposure testing, dust testing, and mud tests, things like that. I don't do tests like these because they're really difficult to replicate in a uniform manner. And in the saltwater corrosion tests case, my intent is not to destroy the handgun in the middle of testing, because if we get through the first 6,000 rounds, I'm going to like keep it. Now, there is some reliability testing that's in our protocols, but this is just what I do and what I don't do. So now that we have the standards, let's go through the protocol itself. Now, our first 1,000 rounds is more or less the handshake phase of this. This is where I figure out what the recoil impulse is like. This is where I figure out what that trigger shoe and trigger bow are all doing. This is how I figure out what the geometry and cut of this frame actually does for my hands, which, by the way, has basically nothing to do with grip angle, because as a for instance, how a frame is specifically cut can actually affect your leverage and friction on the gun itself, because how stuff clamps down is actually really important. So no, this has nothing to do, generally speaking, with undercuts. I think people that whine about Glock knuckle, generally speaking, wear scarves and also own chairs that face their bed frames. I care nothing about loaded chamber indicator cuts on barrels, because if your pistol is properly cared for, you're going to get carbon and oil splash on your dot glass anyway. What matters more to me is that in this first 1,000 rounds, which the gun is lubricated properly, and we take it out in its base format to see how it functions before I start investing attention into this thing, is, can I tell you about this pistol? And that has nothing to do with the list of junk on a promotional ad that you can just see with your eyes. It's, how does it handle with all of these characteristics put together? How does it recoil impulse? As a matter of fact, the vast majority of stock triggers are just fine in that you can be fast and accurate with it, but how does that trigger shoe lock up with your individual trigger finger, and how does that leverage itself into either a rock solid trigger pull that's straight to the rear and consistent, or can you physically feel things moving around because the ledges that are cut onto that trigger bow had no consideration for the individual person because it was designed like 40 years ago, as a for instance. So this is where we more or less figure out the base characteristics of this thing. This is why the overall stoppage rate is at sub 1%, because if there is a air quotes break-in period for this, in which you have really heavy coatings on the internals, really tight tolerances straight out the factory because the gun's made to shoot, turbo straight, things like that, you're going to run into a couple of issues, especially if you're using essentially, proportionally, garbage house 115 grain target ammunition as the balance of the vast majority of your training. So if you're going to run into initial hiccups, they're likely going to happen right here. You're also going to run into possible issues because, again, if you have those metallurgy problems and stuff like that, you're going to run into them in that first 1,000 rounds because it won't make it much further than that. So this is the initial handshake period, and generally speaking, I don't bring cameras out all that much for that, mostly because I'm focused on paying attention to the handgun, being able to tell that story about how it handles versus the junk that's listed on the website. Now, post this, it's to be cleaned, inspected for any of the things that we previously talked about, and then it's to be put back together, properly lubed up, not overly lubed up, because now we're going to start our reliability testing. As far as the reliability testing is concerned, it isn't a friggin' torture test. This is a test that every modern service or self-defense handgun should pass easily, and that is the following. The defense load test. 100 rounds loaded into magazines that are shot straight through the handgun. As previously stated, once you figure out the defense loads that work for this thing, great, now we're going to shoot 100 rounds straight through the thing. Unlike the 115 grain that's going to make up the rest of your testing for this, there should be no stoppages. 100 rounds on a cleaned up gun that is shooting the loads it was more or less made for should not have a problem, hardly ever. As an example, as far as the M9A1 that was tested in-house by the Marine Corps and by other various entities, using 124 grain military ball, which is what the handgun was made for, the mean rounds fired between stoppages was over 18,000 rounds. So 100 is comparatively nothing. If this thing has an issue in firing 100 rounds straight of defense loads in the modern era, where basically every pistol considers a jacketed defense load in the initial design phases, there is a rather large issue. The next thing that happens with us is that we start to test an austere environment that we could uniformly apply to every handgun that we test, and that is we bring up a 5-gallon bucket, fill it with water, set it out front, load 100 rounds into magazines. The handgun itself goes into said 5-gallon bucket, sits at the bottom for 2 minutes. This allows not just the whole thing to fill up with water, but to bleed out a whole bunch of lubrication that you put into it the night before. Once those 2 minutes are up, you take all 100 rounds of now your target load, that's the 115 grain stuff, so it's the weaker stuff. Keep them all balled up in your hands. They go straight into the water until the bubbles stop. Pull that out of the water, set it on the table, drag the pistol out, load it, chamber it. By now, anything that should have bogged anything in that system down should be shaken loose because you jacked the slide on this thing and loaded a brand new round in it. 100 rounds. The acceptable failure rate during this is 1. And the reason why it's 1 is firing pin travel. There still could be a bunch of water that's in that channel. You could get a stoppage on that first or the second round, but once everything starts to violently shake, the gun should do just fine for the rest of that round count. Next thing after this, and we use powder blast for this, is the dry test. Now the dry test is exactly what it sounds like. I don't use brake cleaner for this because, yeah, it'll get the thing dry, but it also strips finish, so I don't use that. I use powder blast instead because it's just an easier way to get everything dry without actually hurting the handgun. The stuff that comes out of this can is typically pretty cold, so if it's hot outside, you gotta wait for all that little dew stuff to come off the moving components, and once the moving components are dry, that's great. Put everything back together. 100 rounds again. Jack pistol, run 100 rounds. Acceptable stoppage rate for that is also 1, with a single exception made for compensated pistols, in that this is a terrible environment for an energy rob system to run. That includes ported guns too. Accepted stoppage rate for that is 2. I know, massive difference, right? But the fact is that if this is a reliable handgun, over the course of these 300 rounds, you should have virtually 0 issues, which is why that standard is the way that it is. So, at this point, we have 1,300 rounds fired through the gun. We have 4,700 left to go. Now, for me personally, this is just regular service life stuff, right? I personally don't do, as I previously stated, torture tests or accelerated wear tests. I don't drop stuff on the concrete. That's not my lane. I figure that the best way to accelerate wear on these things is to shoot them at an accelerated rate, because 6,000 rounds through a handgun, especially a modern one, at around about 3-ish or so months, depending on how long that takes, is enough accelerated wear, especially if you're just using the things and you're in different environments and you're dealing with different conditions, especially seeming as I have a tendency to attract really crappy weather regardless of time of year. With no accelerators for wear in place other than just shooting the thing at an accelerated rate, I take care of the thing normally. I try to keep the thing cleaned up every 1,000 rounds or so, mostly because I'm trying to give the thing a fair shot regardless to whether or not I have a bias in one direction or another, because as many of you know, you literally had to pull my teeth to get me to get a friggin' RXM. And all this really is to give it a fair shot, because if you have a standard in place, if you have numbers for stoppages that are acceptable, and if you live by that math, that essentially negates any biases that you have. Because I could have some real negative feelings toward this thing. I'm like, golly, this thing stopped a whole lot, but I'm taking notes on how many stoppages it actually has. But it had like 12 stoppages over the course of 6,000 rounds. That more or less negates me just being a about this. And once we get to the end, we evaluate based off of those numbers. So that's essentially all I've got on this, right? And I feel that it is a very straightforward, rather polished way of taking care of a testing protocol for things that we're fairly used to as far as reliability is concerned, taking into account the quality, which is bad, of the training ammunition that we use in bulk for the cheap, because that's why you're buying it anyway, is because it's friggin' cheap. So as I've previously stated, now that you've heard all of this, if you want to see these play out, like if you want to see the reliability testing as a for instance make its way into future videos, mostly because it's like, hey, I would be interested, it should do perfect, but I would be interested in seeing how the water test does, or the self-defense load test does, or especially relative to accuracy, or the dry test does in like B-roll in the background. Make some mention of it as far as that's concerned. Talk about mean number of rounds per individual stoppage if you can, which I probably can't because I don't record each individual round fired. I just notice when the stoppage happens. But tell me what you'd like to see, or if you don't want to see any of that and you're like, huh, neat process, moving on, just let me know in the comments also. But I figure that this is a fair and consistent way to evaluate equipment, especially for guys that come out to class that take our advice and then go elsewhere with their equipment, right? At least we have data to provide as far as things that we have tested in the past. This isn't just anecdotal stuff that I get to see because I fired a bunch of rounds through it and I was like, feels nice to me, right? There's a lot of quantifiable stuff that more or less has to make its way into our testing, which I believe is an intelligent thing to do if you are a gear tester. But that's all I've really got on this, guys. If you want to come out and train with us, you can absolutely do that. We have open enrollment classes on the website scheduled through December, and you can easily set up a private class with us. All you have to do is find our contact information on said website. If you would like to check out our little social media links for the different stuff that we've got, including the new Discord that I just propped up, you can do that too. And if you want to support us through Patreon, you can absolutely do that as well. If you want to get something out of it, $41 a month gets you as much open enrollment training as you would like, provided that it isn't a logistically challenging course like a soft skin vehicle class, as for instance, or a private class for rather obvious reasons. And in addition to this, Patreon supporters typically get a little bit earlier access to the videos that I put out. So if that's something that interests you, feel free to support us, because we are consistently funded after all these years through you guys, and I could not appreciate anybody more than you. Links for all of this are in the description below, and remember, a regular guy's firearm is the last defense against tyranny. Be easy.